Water flowing from the Prophet's hands. One day in the desert, hundreds of men were dying of thirst. There was no well, no river, no rain. Then Prophet Muhammad placed his hands into an empty bowl, and water began to flow. Have you ever been so thirsty that you would do anything for a single drop of water? Now imagine hundreds of men, soldiers, fathers, brothers on their knees in the sand, with nothing left. This is what happened next. The sun was merciless. It had been merciless since before dawn, since the moment the first man had risen from his sleeping mat and looked at the sky and seen no clouds, no promise of shade, no mercy coming from any direction. Just a pale white sun climbing steadily toward the center of the sky like something that had made a decision and would not be talked out of it. The column moved slowly. Too slowly. Hundreds of men stretched across the desert floor in a long broken line, soldiers, companions, travelers who had joined the march with full containers and confident steps and were now walking with their eyes down and their mouths closed, because opening your mouth in this heat cost you moisture you could not afford to lose. The sand beneath their feet was not the soft sand of dunes. It was hard and pale and fine, and it rose with every step in small clouds that coated the lips and settled in the eyes and found its way into every fold of clothing. No one spoke. When water is gone, words go with it. They had been marching for days. The route had seemed straightforward when they set out. The distance had seemed manageable. But the desert does not care about plans. The desert does not negotiate. It simply is what it is, vast and white and indifferent, and it waits for the moment when a man discovers that the distance he thought he could cover is longer than the water he thought he had. That moment had come. The water was gone. Not low. Not almost gone. Gone. The last drop had been drunk hours ago. The containers had been scraped empty, turned inside out, sucked dry until the leather itself tasted of nothing but old dust. Men had traded with each other. I'll give you my last bread for a mouthful of your water, and then even those trades had stopped because there was nothing left to trade. The leather skins lay empty and deflated at men's sides like shed snake skin. And the nearest well was a distance that, in this heat, with no water, might as well have been the other side of the world. Men began to slow. A young soldier barely old enough to have a full beard sat down in the sand without meaning to. His legs simply stopped working. He looked at the ground between his knees for a long moment, then looked up at the men passing him, and none of them stopped because none of them had anything to give him. An older man near the middle of the column poured the last contents of his container onto his palm. Not to drink, there was nothing to drink, just to feel the coolness on his skin one more time. He held his palm up and watched the tiny remaining drops evaporate before they could reach his lips. He stared at his dry palm for a long moment. Then he kept walking. Two companions walked side by side without speaking. They had marched together for years. They had fought together. They had laughed together around fires at night when the world felt manageable. Now they walked in silence because there was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying more clearly. The murmurs started somewhere in the middle of the column. Low at first. Barely audible above the sound of feet on sand and the dry wind moving across the desert floor. But murmurs in a desperate army grow the way fire grows, slowly at first, then faster than you can track. We will not make it. There is no water. The nearest well is too far. Men are going to die here. The words passed from mouth to mouth through the column like a current, not panic yet, but the thing that lives just before panic. The thing that looks like calm but is actually the last moment before calm breaks. Word reached Prophet Muhammad. A companion approached him quietly, so as not to spread the fear further, and told him what he already knew. The men are finished. The water is completely gone. We have searched every container. There is nothing. The Prophet listened. He did not rush. He did not show alarm. He looked at the horizon for a moment, that same merciless horizon that offered nothing, no cloud, no green, no shimmer of water, and then he turned back. He asked for whatever containers remained. They brought them everything the army had left. Small bowls of clay. Leather pouches worn thin from years of use. A few metal vessels dented from travel. Whatever could be found, whatever could hold liquid, whatever had not already been abandoned on the march. They placed them in front of him. Empty. All of them empty. Bone dry and smelling of dust and old leather and the memory of water. He looked at them for a moment. Then he reached forward and took a single small bowl, the kind a man might use to wash his hands, nothing special, nothing sacred, just clay and desert dust, and placed it on the ground in front of him. He looked at it. Then he placed his hands inside it. Both hands. Fingers spread. And he was still. The man standing closest saw it first. He was not looking for a miracle. He was not standing there with hope or expectation or open eyes searching for something extraordinary. He was doing what exhausted men do, looking at the ground, conserving energy, trying to stay upright, trying to breathe through a throat that felt like it was lined with sand. But something made him look up. Maybe it was a sound. Maybe it was a movement. Maybe it was something that had no name, some instinct that had been built into human beings long before they had words for instinct. Whatever it was, he looked up. And he saw the bowl. He blinked, looked again. Still there. Water, actual water pushing up between the Prophet's fingers. Not a drip. Not a seep. Flowing. Like a spring that had been waiting underground for 1,000 years and had finally found its way to the surface. Clean and cold and catching the desert light in a way that made it almost painful to look at, the way any beautiful thing is painful when you have been without it long enough. The man opened his mouth. No sound came out. He stood there with his mouth open like a man who has forgotten how language works, staring at a bowl of water appearing from a pair of human hands in the middle of a waterless desert, and his mind simply stopped. The way a wheel stops when something jams in the mechanism. Not broken. Just stopped. He reached out and grabbed the arm of the man next to him. Said nothing. Just grabbed and pointed. That man looked. His face did the same thing, the eyes going wide, the mouth opening, the brain receiving information it had no category for. He turned to the man behind him. Grabbed his arm. Pointed. No words yet. Just pointing. Just the universal human gesture for look at this right now. I cannot explain it, but you need to see it. Then someone somewhere in the cluster of men pressing forward found his voice. Water. Just the one word. Barely above a whisper. But in the silence of a dying army in a dead desert, it landed like a stone dropped into still water. rings spreading outward in every direction. Water. The Prophet. His hands. There is water. Come. Come now. They came. All of them. The man who had sat down in the sand and could not rise rose. The old soldier who had watched the last drops evaporate from his palm turned and pushed through the crowd. The two companions who had walked in silence for hours broke into a run. They came with their bowls and their pouches and their helmets turned upside down and their cupped hands held out in front of them and whatever vessel they could find or fashion or improvise from what they carried. They pressed forward, hundreds of men jostling and pushing, not out of selfishness but out of something more primal, something that the body does when it has been without water long enough and suddenly water appears. The body takes over. The body moves before the mind can form a thought. A young soldier near the front filled his bowl and drank without stopping and filled it again. His hands were shaking so badly that water spilled down his wrists and he didn't care, he didn't stop, he just drank. A father, a man who had spent the entire march not complaining so his younger companions wouldn't lose heart, stood at the edge of the crowd, and when he finally reached the bowl and filled his container he walked a few steps away and turned his back to the crowd and stood there for a moment with his full container pressed against his forehead before he drank. Just stood there, feeling the coldness of it, grateful in a way that his body understood before his mind did. An old companion, a man who had been in every battle, who had seen things that should have made him unshakable, stood at the back of the crowd with tears running freely down his face. He didn't wipe them. He didn't try to stop them. He just stood there watching the water flow and let the tears fall and didn't say a word. And the water kept coming. Man after man stepped forward and filled what he carried and stepped away, and another took his place, and still it flowed. Steady and cold and real and impossible. As if the hands were connected not to a bowl but to something beneath the desert floor, something beneath the bedrock, something beneath the world itself, as if the source of the water was not in that small clay bowl at all but somewhere ancient and vast and completely beyond the reach of human understanding. The sun beat down. The desert stretched in every direction. And in the center of it all a man sat with his hands in a bowl. And the water flowed. Every man drank. Every container was filled, not half full, not enough to survive on, but full. Completely full. The leather pouches that had been scraped and sucked dry were now heavy and dripping. The clay bowls that had smelled of dust now smelled of cold water. The metal vessels that had reflected nothing but sunlight now held something real, something living, something that made the difference between dying in this desert and walking out of it. Every cracked lip was wet. Every burning throat was cooled. Every man who had sat down in the sand and stopped moving rose. The column that had been dissolving man by man, step by step, into the desert floor pulled itself back together. Straightened. Steadied. Men who had been walking with their eyes down looked up again. Men who had stopped speaking found words again. The low sound of a living army movement, breath, conversation returned to the desert air. And when the last man stepped away from the bowl, Prophet Muhammad lifted his hands. The water stopped. Instantly. Completely. The bowl sat empty on the sand, dry as it had been before he touched it, as if nothing had happened, except that hundreds of men were standing in the desert alive, full, steady with expressions on their faces that none of them would ever fully be able to describe to anyone who had not been there. One of the companions, Jabir ibn Abdullah, watched the whole thing from beginning to end. He was a young man then. Strong. Sharp-eyed. The kind of man who notices details and remembers them. He stood in that desert and watched water pour from a human hand like a mountain spring. He watched the faces of the men as they came forward. He watched the old soldier weep. He watched the father press the cold container to his forehead. He watched the last man drink and step away and the water stop. He remembered all of it. He carried it with him for the rest of his life through battles and losses and decades and the slow accumulation of years that turn a young man's hair white and line his face with time. And when he was very old, when most of the men who had stood in that desert with him were gone, people would still come to sit with him and ask him about that day. Young people who had only heard the story second-hand. Scholars who wanted the details exact. Travelers who had come a long distance just to hear it from someone who had been there. They would ask, how many men were there, and Jabir would look at them with the quiet, certain eyes of a man who has seen something that cannot be unseen, and he would say, even if we had been 100,000. A pause. It would have been enough. The desert is still there. The same sand. The same sun. The same silence that swallows everything eventually. But somewhere in the memory of that ground something happened that no geology explains and no well was ever dug deep enough to reach. A man placed his hands in an empty bowl. And the water came. 300 men watched water flow from his hands. Every single one of them saw it. The question is, if you had been standing there, what would you have done? Tell us in the comments.